Hi Guy, welcome to the AMIGArama podcast. As always, I'm your host Lorfarius, and in this week's show we are going to be looking at Head Over Heels. I'm sure a fair few of you will remember that from the old 8-bit Spectrum and Commodore 64 days. Anyway, it was certainly a classic, and I was definitely surprised to see that it found its way onto the Amiga, so I'm looking forward to covering that one in a bit. Before we cover that though, we do need to look at some of this week's Amiga news. I came across some really intriguing video stuff this week thanks to the Retro Recipe YouTube channel. Now it turns out that he paid a visit to Chris Blythe's house, and that's the guy who used to work for Team 17 back in the 90s, and he was behind a lot of the FMV work on the first Worms game. I'm not sure if you even remember that, but it was basically CGI in the real early days. I think we're talking pre-Jurassic Park and all that sort of stuff. After leaving the company, he managed to pack away a big pile of company gear, including his Amiga 4000 and a load of backup drives with lots and lots of those cartridge tapes that you used to get. The two of them spent several hours trying to get all of this working again, and it was really fascinating to see it all switch on after a good 20 odd years. I think this lot was stashed in his garage or possibly his shed. I don't want to ruin the video too much for you guys. What's even more surprising is that this was the same Amiga that he managed to use in the set for Titanic. A lot of history buried in that good old beige box. If you love the Amiga, then you need to go and watch this. It's essential viewing, and it'll be in the show notes, so follow the link that I'll be posting. Moving on, I'm sure that everyone's aware of who David J. Pleasance is by now, especially his Commodore The Inside Story book that came out last year. It might have been a few months ago actually. One thing I have to mention is a bit of random news that I stumbled on a couple of weeks back now. But he's just posted an audio CD over on his website with a free download of Amiga related music. It has a lot of tributes to the Amiga itself and J minor, and it seems to have been made thanks to an Amiga 4000 stashed away in the studio. Is there anything the Amiga 4000 can't do? The download for the CD is free of course in MP3 format, but if you want to support him, there's a printed version available for just £9. I think that's plus shipping. I quite enjoyed listening to it. It's all instrumental, and it's guitar and stuff. It's well worth getting your hands on a copy. I had an awesome time with it. There seems to be loads of these Amiga type music things coming out, and there's a worldwide shipping option too, so don't be worried if you're outside the UK and think you can't get your hands on a copy. Honestly, go and have a look at the details in the notes and let me know what you think. Lastly, before we move on, I had to mention a game I saw over on Steam. Usually I don't bother going near anything that's modern or not out yet, but when a studio goes back to a Psygnosis classic like Walker and tries to remake it for a modern audience, it's bound to catch my attention. We did our Walker episode around 30 shows ago. God, how long ago was that? And it did have a lot of problems as a game, but the idea itself was sound. It just needed a lot more tweaks and changes around the edges to make it into a proper amazing game. Well, at least I seem to think so anyway. A lot of people do like that one, but it did have its issues. Seems that Tequila Bike Studios are giving it another go with what they've called B.A. Walker. They've made a few changes like flipping the screen. I think the old one went from right to left. This time it's left to right. And giving it a fancy, up-to-date graphical look. Something for more modern audiences. From the footage I saw and the bit of gameplay on show, it does look absolutely amazing. It's definitely one that I'm going to be buying when it comes out. The biggest plus though, and probably the biggest problem with Walker at the time, is that there's upgradable and changeable weapons. There's more than one to be used. I couldn't see any mention of Psygnosis on the page though, and it looks different enough to be seen as something new from the original, and it's definitely an interesting one to keep an eye on. It should be out later this year according to Steam, and I'm really looking forward to it. I think that just about wraps it up for this week's news. No matter how many times I say it, it always amazes me just how much I can find to fill an episode for news. There's bound to be loads that I'm missing, so if you see see something that might be worth a mention, then by all means drop me a line at the usual place. For now, let's just see how head over heels we can be about this week's game. Okay, it's confession time. I've always struggled to play isometric games, and I don't think I've ever been able to wrap my head around the entire concept, the weird angles and that really odd viewpoint. They just have this feel to them that just refuses to click in my brain, and I always start out determined to play one through to the end, and I end up giving up before very long. I just can't do them. There's so many high-tech classics of this type of game on the Amiga though that I'm going to have to get round to more of them eventually. To start with, I've always been aware of Head Over Heels as a game, even if I've only really ever played its Batman predecessor over on the ZX Spectrum. I have this vague memory of picking up a copy as a kid, spending weeks in frustration at the puzzles and the jumping, but always feeling like I was getting my money's worth. That's quite an odd contradiction, I'm sure there. Even though with my urge to give up, I always find myself wanting to play a bit further, and if there's any that might have a chance at bringing me round and bringing me back to this style of game, it might just have to be today's. Published and developed by Ocean in-house, who did games like A-Train, Burning Rubber, Cabal, Echo, Hook, Jurassic Park, New Zealand Story, one of the all-time Amiga greats there. The list just goes on. They were prolific, they were the EA of the day. I think I keep saying this about Ocean, but the more and more I look into them as like an entire company, they were absolutely massive. And I just think it's a real shame that they just disappeared into the ether. That's good old Ubisoft, wasn't it? Because they bought them out in the mid-90s and got rid of them. Anyway, I'm going off topic there. Now, this came out in 1991 and it was just on one floppy disk. A single player game that was released at £7.99. It was a budget title. Now, it was all coded by Colin Porch, who only ever worked on this one. I'm not sure what happened there. Music-wise, he did the graphics as well, by the way. It's all part of the same code because it's a conversion. The music was done by Keith Tinman, who worked on Batman the Caped Crusader, Hook, Midnight Resistance before, and Pushover, as well as a few others. I think we've done a fair few of those. We really are working through the Ocean list. Now, I'm afraid there's nothing vastly improved for Head Over Heels. It has the look and feel of the original 8-bit version, and at first glance, it's a pretty straightforward 8 to 16-bit port. I'm never one to give up on a game if it has an Amiga release though, so we will just have to have a look at the Spectrum version for all of its story and history. From what I could discover, John Rittman was the chap responsible for the original game, and it turns out one of the main reasons he even worked on the Spectrum in the first place was because it gave him a lot more creative freedom compared to, say, the Commodore and the C64. They were all based more around sprite-based scrolling, which he was never really a fan of. Now, you have to remember that these were the 8-bit days and things were very different compared to the later 16-bit counterparts, because there was just the two big competitors, Atari and Commodore. Head's overall concept actually came about when John was working over on Matchday. He was dropping off the final master copy for Ocean to publish when he noticed Night Law being played in the background. Taken back by its art style, his first thought was just how jaw-dropping it all looked, and his first impression was just how the game was like a Disney film that you could actually control. It does sound bizarre. Quite the difference from the likes of side-on titles, I suppose, such as Manic Miner, and I'm guessing everything else that was available during the 80s. getting his hands on a copy, and after figuring out how it all worked, the next step for him was to try and create a better version in the form of a game engine. And soon after he'd figured that out, he used that to create the isometric Batman game, which has got Batman and Robin in, as well as the Batmobile. Coming up with all of the different aspects, John realised that he really enjoyed creating the abilities for Batman, and soon decided to add similar things when making Head Over Heels. Both games use the same game engine, with heads being changed to allow more than one main character, when Batman had only focused on one. Yeah, I might have been wrong there, I don't think Robin was actually in it. It's been a very long time, I've not played that thing in like 25, 30 years even. The benefit of having another character allowed John to refine the engine a lot more with puzzles, and it fast became one of his favourite things for the game. The puzzles were often designed on their own, with special moments added where the two characters would cross paths, with the planets made to match as he expanded all of the surrounding areas and levels. It was the intention from the start to limit puzzles to single rooms, because otherwise players would probably forget where stuff was around the world. But that didn't stop the use of items around the rooms themselves. Bernie Drummond was brought on board to help create the graphics, often with John telling him he needed a few designs and then letting Bernie's imagination run wild. John would then pick out his favourites from all of the designs he saw, and those were put into the game. Most were just created from mostly random ideas thrown together whenever he was working on the game. However, Daleks and Prince Charles were in the news an awful lot of the time, so those were definitely at the front of his mind when he decided to use them in the game. They seemed to be pretty odd and wacky designs that fast became fan favourites on either system, at least from what I could see. When it came to testing, thanks to having a handy development kit at home, he'd invite people round to his house to play the latest build and then use them to help make changes as discovered all sorts of issues and problems. He also realised from watching them play that he needed different types of puzzles in the game that weren't just limited to simple platforming. So the whole game, as he put it, naturally developed over time, and he was glad that he had that experience at home because it really added to the overall design. You would think with so many puzzles and an isometric 3D structure, there would have been a lot of planning to bring everything together, but he does admit in an interview that he didn't do much at all and was just making it all up as he went along. It sounds the best way to work and stuff. Even when it came to things like the crazy story, all of that was made up on the spot right before it was sent off for printing. Talk about last minute randomness, as you'll see in a bit when we talk about it. On finishing the history, Head Over Heels is a game that John is certainly very proud of, and going through its history, it appears to be one of those true 8-bit wonders. It came along at just the right time and everyone seems to fondly remember it. There was even a free PC remake called Head Over Heels Respec that came out way back in 2003, and that's still available to this day. For modern gamers, it might just be the best way to go and play the game through, but that's not to take away from the Amiga part, as we need to give it a good going over. It did receive a fair few ports, one on the Amstrad CPC 464, of course on the Atari STE, Commodore 64, MSX, PC, which will have been DOS, and finally the ZX Spectrum, and what I'm sure everyone will be thinking back to. Head and Heels have been captured, separated and imprisoned in the castle headquarters of Blacktooth. Your job is to get them both out of the castle and into the marketplace so that they can join up again. From there, the journey leads to Moonbase headquarters, where you'll have to decide either to try to escape back to freedom or be a true hero and teleport to one of the slave planets to search for its lost crown. To overthrow the dictatorship on any of the slave planets would be a major blow to Blacktooth, and you could return to freedom in glory. Of course, look at the English on this isn't the best, is it? Of course, Blacktooth would probably enslave them again eventually, but it would slow down any expansion he plans for now. The populace of Blacktooth are so heavily oppressed that they would have to see all 4 of the slave planets revolt before the Blacktooth crown could cause an uprising. This of course would be the ultimate accolade and unfortunately almost certain suicide. Yeah, that really does seem like a last minute told story. It's not the best, is it? Hey, when you push for time, you've got to come up with something, and I suppose it sort of gets the job done, though I'm not sure what type of job he's actually applying for there. The aim of the game then is to try and capture a crown for each of the 5 worlds that you can visit using the double up powers of head and heels. Beginning as Head in a 3D isometric room, you're surrounded by a line of ominous prison bars, a magic teleporter, and a single doorway with, well, a few jumpable blocks which show off a bunny rabbit sat on top of them. Straight away with that, there's something very different about this game. I'm not quite sure how to explain the main characters either. They do match the names, mostly consisting of feet and a noggin with these big puppy noses. Cutesy looks all the way that put me more in mind of puppies definitely than anything else that I've seen. It's as mad as it can be, and it certainly comes across that way. Along the bottom of the screen are icons for collected items, donuts and skill increases that are all linked to various things that can be found throughout the many floors, depending on which part of the planet you're on. Most screens will have a solvable puzzle that you can finish as either a pair or alone, and often take the form of pushing blocks, leaping over several jumps like platforms, and avoiding collapsing floors. Not to mention things like conveyor belts and death-defying leaps that need to be considered very carefully depending on the room you're in. Obstacles in the rooms can be simple switches, mountable hush puppies. What on earth is going on with this game with cats and dogs? Springs with spikes or pits even, often causing you all sorts of trouble. There is no map to be seen, and the manual recommends that you draw your own, with the rooms often having no sort of ceiling so you can leap up to other levels depending on which character you've got selected. Leaving and re-entering a room will reset its state, so finding yourself stuck with a puzzle is often a case of walking in and back out again just to reset it all. Using F1 will swap between the 2 characters, with F3 press for carrying items and space to fire a donut. Pressing fire will make you leap, and the controls to move are probably the strangest part of the game. Pressing up will move you north, which is off to the right, with down moving you south, which is off to the left. And you always have to keep in mind that you're controlling the characters at an angle. It's a very odd thing to see and play. I suppose it's a familiar type of play for these type of isometric games. It's something you should take some time to get used to, though. It did take me absolutely ages, but again, I never really get on with this type of a game. Cuddly bunny rabbits adorn the levels, with each one either giving you a couple of lives, invincibility, increased jumping height with heels, or go faster if you were using head. The first screen did show a bunny for Head to pick up, and it's an easy way to see how the whole system works. It's not very complicated beyond heels being able to grab a bag, which then in turn lets him carry items around the planets. It's sort of like a mini inventory, and it's essential for most of the later puzzles, so you want to grab that thing as soon as you can get it. Next item is called a hooter, and that can only be used by Head to fire donuts, but it does have limited shots. You will find there are trays of donuts holding 6 different shots placed throughout levels, but they're always in a limited supply, so you really need to proceed carefully, not blow your lot in one go. There's also a reincarnation fish, which acts as a sort of current game save. Collecting one will let you reload the game as you are. That's if you've run out of lives, and if you're intent to sink a lot of time into the puzzles, it can be a lifesaver. Perhaps in modern times, most of us will just use an emulator quick save, but this is a neat feature for the time. I'd like to have seen this in a lot more games. I certainly don't see it in very many others. As far as items go, it's a good selection, and it never grows tiresome from the ones I've seen. Head Over Heels has 5 various planets to explore, including exotic places like Egyptus, Blacktooth Penitentiary, which is the Empire's prison planet in the starting section, Safari World, Book World. Between all the planets, there's a grand total of 300 rooms to explore. This is absolutely packed to the rafters with content. Most enemies are of the Dalek variety, with many hovering in these random patterns around the screen, and they tend to act more like obstacles than any real sort of threat. There's not much of an AI there. They can cause problems when you need to push objects in the rooms to line up jumps, say, but often a quick blast of a donut will see them off if you have enough going spare. Again, you've got to keep in mind, once you've fired them, there's not always a lot more laying around for you to reload your weapon with. Sorry, the hooter. Reload the hooter. We have to talk about those graphics. Each world matches the theme of its name, the oddest probably being the book world with these great sized books and, well, toasters littering the floors. It's an eclectic, wacky mix that really does the developer proud. I'm not sure what he was drinking at the time when he was designing this, but it certainly comes across as bizarre. The style is very similar to its 8-bit counterpart, the only difference being a much broader use of colour and in some cases better drawn objects. None of it really pops or stands out as anything special though, so I wouldn't go into playing this expecting some magnificent 16-bit update. Beyond the intro music when you first load the game, the only sounds are the effects on each of the planets. These are mostly quite limited with things like moving headed tails, footsteps, because it plays this strange sort of rapid metallic ping instead of actual footsteps. It's very bizarre. There's very little else to be heard and only a brief tune plays if you manage to find something special. It's sparse at the best of times, so don't be expecting anything to catch your attention. Head Over Heels does have its issues though, and we need to dig deep to find them. The first up is the lack of anything new for the Amiga. No fancy graphical effects or even improved visuals over like the 8-bit counterpart, and the basic sounds are disappointing at best. Keep in mind this was a 1991 release when the Amiga was close to dominating like the entire games market. They were doing great things for the system and this just does so very little. At first I thought there was something wrong with the joystick controls as I couldn't get the characters to move properly. They just feel a little bit too strict and set hard in all 4 directions. I would have preferred to have it a bit looser. I try my best to use the stick on the pad, but after 10 minutes I just dropped them completely and switched over to my keyboard. That felt for me much easier and natural to use, though it might depend on how you want to play the game. One thing I really would have liked to have seen is a way to rotate the screen. I know this isn't that sort of game, but when you're often stuck with these mind-bending puzzles and you've really got your head around these controls, it doesn't always gel correctly, and it would have been just easy for me to be able to flick it around. I'm sure that's something the Amiga could have done, and I know later versions of games have done stuff like that. I didn't find myself though stuck behind objects too often, and it's drawn well enough that for the most part it won't be an issue. It all comes down to personal taste. And that's about it really for the problems I could find for it. I never said they were going to be very big. For the magazine reviews, CU Amiga gave this 94%, Amiga Power 92%, The One 91, this is really high, Amiga Action was down at 80% and then it drops again for Amiga Format at 79%. I'll say this now before we go any further, but I'm probably the wrong sort of person to review isometric games like this. I tried so many times just to sit and play this through properly, but the whole 3D view with Head Over Heels just annoyed me at no end. I did my best to be fair to it and I put my odd feelings aside, but just keep in mind that I might not be the right person to play this sort of game. I can only tell you all how I came away from the experience. The longer I played, the more it came across as a missed opportunity. It doesn't do anywhere near enough to earn being a port. The colours and style reminded me more of a high-end C64 game, with the screen info around the edges seeming to be lifted straight from the Spectrum. That's not to say they haven't made some effort to at least add some graphical flair. The world and characters all benefit from a much richer colour palette with those sharper graphics, yet it leaves you with this strong feeling of just being a lacklustre port. It's a waste of the Amiga's potential to not at least add some tracks or decent music for all the planets, and I would have loved for each one to have a matching ditty. Ocean had plenty of skilled musicians around this time, especially on staff, but they really let the ball drop here, and all you're left with is this dull version of what could have been a very good game. Even if they were aiming to sell this at budget prices, it could have easily sold as well as the 8-bit peer with just a little bit more effort. At its core, there's a good game here. The puzzles are inventive, clever, and challenging enough to bring you back for more. That's assuming you can cope with the controls the way they are. I tried my best for the joystick, but it quickly got relegated to the bin, whilst the keyboard was just easier for me to use. This made for a much more responsive experience in my eyes, and I was soon bounding around the levels more accurately than the joystick could ever manage. Even on WinUAE and an Xbox pad, I didn't do much better, but you might have more luck. Just give it a go and see what you think. One plus point it has is the two characters link up. That all works surprisingly well, and although there's a lot of instant kill puzzles, it's often a case of you taking your time and working your way through steadily. There's some devious, tricky jumps and traps placed around the planets that you can usually get past if you plan out the levels properly. With something like Mario, you need to be constantly on the move, but this is a bit more ponderous and it makes you think about what you need to do. Being separated in a room, then having to navigate enemies and objects, timing jumps to help the other character made me chuckle a fair few times, and the difficulty never had me tearing my hair out. If you can get past its quirks and try not to compare it to the earlier ports, there's a lot in this to enjoy. But I suspect if you're a fan of John Rittman's games, you're going to come away from this feeling extremely disappointed. This feels like a relic that's in desperate need of a fresh lick of paint, and it just left me wanting more from the coder. Better luck next time, I guess, Ocean. To finish, this isn't something I'd recommend, and you'd probably best stick into the 2003 remake, at least if you want to see a decent take on what Head Over Heels should have been. And it's done little to change my way of thinking, especially on isometric games as a whole. I know it's been requested, but I'm actually worried now about covering Heimdall in future, but I guess that's going to be another show entirely. Well, it's about time to draw the show to a close. Of course, if you want to comment on anything I've said today or even disagree on a certain level, you can drop me an email on Lorfarius@AMIGArama.com. Follow me on Twitter, which is @AmigaRamaPod, or even come on to the Facebook page, which is facebook.com/AmigaRama. If you'd like to help the show out, then by all means, please leave us a review over on iTunes. It's a good and easy way to get us heard by more people and get us shared where possible. Or if you'd really like to help, you can come along to patreon.com/AmigaRama and offer some support there. A lot of listeners do offer some support on there, and honestly, it's absolutely heartwarming that you like the show enough to contribute and keep me going every week. Every penny goes back into the show. I do promise you this for a start. I spend a lot of time editing, coming up with show notes, and I suppose you could sort of call it scripts. I do plan these things out. I'm always trying to improve the show, and every little bit that you guys can either give or help or contribute does help out. I do appreciate it. Now we need to send out a big thank you to all of our Patreons. This week they are 10 Minute Amiga Retrocast, who does a great weekly Amiga show, Adam Bradley, Darren Coles, Gary Hevitt, Graham Vebke, Glenn Milford from Casual Retro Gamer Weekly, Jan Holbo Rasmussen, Jason Warnes, Laurent Giraud, O'Brien's Retro and Vintage, Pistol, Premsky, Quentin Barnes, Retro Ravi, Richard Legg, Richard Pearson, Sneff, Steve Engeldo, and finally Treble. Thanks for listening, and until next time, guys.